Welcome to the show, everyone. We are talking about Stephen King connections, explaining how Stephen King's works connect with one another, the Stephen King multiverse at large, as it were. We're talking about the concept of Stephen King's Maine, how his stories in his books overlap, recurring characters, recurring landscapes, how the Dark Tower holds it all together. If you're curious about any of this, you're in the right place. And also, there is a timestamp down in the description box below that will cover everything that we talk about. If you're looking for something specific, you might want to check out the timestamp. Bev Vincent is with me. He's an author of fiction and nonfiction, happens to be an expert on the Stephen King multiverse, and has even written books about it. He wrote this book, which I can attest is very good, The Road to the Dark Tower. He also wrote the Stephen King Companion, which is themed right in with what we're talking about here today. He's also an author of some novellas, some short stories. He has a story in Flight or Fright, a popular collection of short stories that Stephen King also has a story in. So you can check down in the description box below for everything that Bev Vincent has done. And I strongly encourage any readers of the Tower series to look into his books on that subject. Bev, how you doing?
Very good, thanks. How are you?
Well, now this is quite a big topic that we're getting into here because King has authored so many books, fiction, nonfiction. So I guess we should start at the beginning. Steve was writing stories as a kid. His mom would pay him, pocket change for little short stories that he would write. And as a young man, he published in magazines. And then, of course, he publishes Carrie. And the rest is history, so to speak, from that point. How much did King know about his multiverse at large when he wrote Carrie? Did he have this all planned out at the time? We know that he plots Salem's Lot, his second novel, in Maine. Maybe you could just tell us some about how King got started writing, and how much do you think he really knew about what he wanted to do with this Stephen King connections concept at the very beginning?
I honestly don't think that he knew very much about that, because what we have to consider is the chronology of the books as they were published as we know them doesn't really bear a very close connection to how he wrote them. So even though Salem's Lot was his second published novel, it was maybe his sixth or seventh written novel. Mm-hmm. And there was a very good possibility that books like Roadwork, Rage, Blaze could have been published earlier than Salem's Lot. So, that was just due to the choices of the market at the time. He couldn't get some of those books published. And he sort of came down to the decision, do we publish Blaze or Salem's Lot? He discussed that with his editor. And so I don't think he really had, in the very early parts of his career, a master plan for tying all of these things together. And really, it's not until the end of his first decade, by which I mean the 70s, not his first 10 years, but by the end of the 70s, that he really starts to dabble in doing that. And the way he starts isn't by interconnecting the novels. It's by acknowledging that certain things that he's written and have been turned into movies were so popular that they have to become part of the character's conscience. They would know about these things. So really, the first nod of King to King takes place in The Dead Zone, when a character says, he's just like that girl in Carrie, talking about the movie, not the real person. And so there was a character who was aware of this phenomenal movie. It was a huge hit when it came out, and the book then became a bestseller, acknowledging something that King had written in a King novel. That was really where it all got started.
Wow. So that was where it came up. It was because the movies were on his mind where he started to want to kind of tie everything in together. It was The Dead Zone, which is a novel that I still haven't completed. I've actually completed 54 Stephen King works at this point, Billy Summers being my most recent. We'll talk about that here in just a bit. Let's talk about some of the recurring landscapes here as we tie this into what Stephen King was doing early on in his career. Castle Rock, or actually, let's just talk about the concept of Stephen King's Maine. Maybe you can just tell us a little bit about what you know about that and what got King really going with that. I know that Stephen King's Maine is actually a setting that some other writers write in, which is very interesting. Joe Hill writes in Stephen King's Maine. And I know that Stephen King's Maine does bear some resemblance to the real state of Maine. However, there are some differences as well. Derry happens to be there in Maine. Castle Rock happens to be there in Maine. So maybe you could just elaborate a little bit on what Stephen King's Maine is as kind of a concept for him as a writer.
Well, there are locations in King's novels, like you mentioned Derry. Derry is very much Bangor. There are some other places that King lived that overlaid on it. So the Barrens doesn't exist in Bangor. He brought that in from another place where he lived.
But correct me if I'm wrong here, because Derry is like based on Bangor. Like there's even like landmarks in it.
Yeah.
However, it's not actually Bangor because Derry and Bangor exist simultaneously in Stephen King's Maine, unless I have that wrong.
That's true. That's true. But you could take a map of Bangor and find most of the layout of Derry in it. So it's very strongly inspired by that. Whereas Castle Rock is a complete fiction. We know roughly where it is, although if you try to pinpoint it exactly, there's a lot of contradictory information in the various places where it's mentioned. It's either 50 miles from this place or it's 100 miles from this place, but we know roughly where it is. It's, sort of south central. Yeah. And then there's the Lakes District part in far western Maine, which appears quite often. Books like Bag of Bones. So the TR90 region came in Dreamcatcher as well. And so that section is very much based on the place where King has a summer home. A house which is very much like Sarah Laughs, which becomes Kara Laughs in the Dark Tower series. I think, and he's ventured beyond Maine in some of his more recent works because he's become more familiar with those places. But you tend to write about the geography that you know and the people that you know. And Maine is more than just a collection of cities and towns and roads. It's the cultural things that he understands, what the people are like, what sort of jobs do they do, what's the climate like, all of these coastal islands that are very much part of the culture of Maine that play into things like Storm of the Century and the Reach. I think most writers who really understand a place want to explore it maybe more in fiction. King does that quite often.
I read The Colorado Kid recently, which is part of 3 novels that King has put together for the Hard Case Crime series of books. I still have later to go, but I liked in The Colorado Kid, it takes place on like one of the islands of Maine out there, which I didn't even know Maine had islands, but I did once I read The Colorado Kid. And it was interesting because in The Colorado Kid, all of the main characters are writers. They're trying to figure out this mystery. And King really kind of gives you an idea of what a writer might be like that lived out on that island, that lived his whole life in Maine. So I thought that was really good. And like you say, Stephen King really does know Maine well, and he uses it over and over again in his plot settings. Let's talk about Castle.
We want to talk about places that recur. If you want to talk about places that recur, so the Colorado Kid, the person originated in Nederland, Colorado.
Right.
And you have just finished reading Billy Summers. On one of Billy's trips back and forth across the country. Where does he pass through? Nederland, Colorado.
Interesting. That was one of the connections that we'll be talking about in this chat that I did not pick up on. His books are just riddled with so many different things that as a constant reader, you think you got most of what was in a book, but there may have even been more there that you missed. Like we talked about the last time we spoke, it would be an unimaginable project to try to put every little piece and part together in Stephen King's works as far as crossover goes.
Well, let me show you something. Maybe you've not encountered this book.
Sure.
So three friends of mine have this book, the Stephen King universe. So Chris Golden, Stanley Weeder, and Hank Wagner. And this one dates back to about 2005, actually 2001. And it is almost 500 pages long. And it is devoted to looking at the connections And this is 20 years ago. So you can
Right.
imagine how big a book would be that, took all the more recent things into account.
When did you publish your piece on the Stephen King Companion?
So the first time that came out was about 2009 or 2010. There's
Okay.
been a couple of versions, like new editions since then, but yeah, the first Stephen King Companion came out in 2010.
I'll have to check that book out. I've been kind of avoiding some of that stuff because I haven't quite finished the catalog yet. There's a book called Stephen King and Philosophy that I really want to
Yes.
read. But I've avoided it because there are a few books in there probably that I don't want the plot spoiled for me. There's another one called Stephen King and Science, which I would really like to read. It's a relatively new book, that one is, but I've avoided it because I don't want to spoil the plots for Gerald's Game, The Dead Zone, Cujo, some of these classic books that I still haven't finished. Those are basically the three big ones right there that I haven't finished. But let's talk about Castle Rock here for a moment. This is arguably King's greatest setting. For me, it's the Tower, but Castle Rock is huge. There's even a television show about it now. In Castle Rock, there are kind of a scattering of short stories that take place there. We have The Dead Zone, Cujo, Uncle Odo's Truck is a short story, The Body, The Dark Half, The Sundog, Needful Things, Elevation. I read Needful Things, I don't know, a couple of years ago. I thought it was a pretty good book. Wasn't big on the ending, which is kind of a thing that can be common complaint with King. I thought it was a good book overall, though, and really quite genius in some ways. I like how Leland Gaunt comes in from Akron, Ohio, which is very close to me here in Canton, Ohio. I've actually been to Akron, Ohio. They have a wonderful library there. Actually, on my YouTube channel, I have a tour of the Akron, Ohio library. But Leland Gaunt comes into Castle Rock. Some mayhem takes place. And then later on, just unexpectedly, I read The Sundog, which I didn't realize was going to be kind of like a prequel to Needful Things. It was kind of the way I discovered the Little Sisters of Illyria. I didn't even know about it, and I discovered it after I finished the Tower series. I was so excited when I found that gem. But I was really happy when I read The Sundog. It's like, okay, we're with Pop Merrill. He has his own little story like Leland Gaunt has. And you get some of kind of the histories of the characters before what we read in Needful Things. So maybe you could just fill us in a little bit about what you know about Castle Rock, how Stephen King got writing there, maybe your favorite story in Castle Rock.
So Castle Rock is first introduced in The Dead Zone again. So we're looking at the book about connections. So it had the first connection to Kerry. It was also the place where Castle Rock was created. And in that book, that's the story of the Castle Rock Killer. There's this series of murders that have taken place over a number of years. And the main character, Johnny Smith,
Let's tread lightly with this one because it's one that I haven't completed. Sure.
But Johnny Smith, who has some psychic powers, is brought in by Sheriff Bannerman to try to solve this series of murders, and that just goes to show how desperate the sheriff is. He's relying on a psychic.
Yeah.
And so the solution to that crime then sort of bleeds over into Cujo, which is the next book that's set in Castle Rock. And since I have to tread lightly, there is a hint that perhaps the perpetrator in the Castle Rock murders is somehow or other haunting Castle Rock. Well, I guess I'll just leave it like that.
I actually like that. Now you have me really intrigued. I'm going to read those damn books this year.
Yeah, so Cujo is really Castle Rock primer. The whole story takes place in Castle Rock, in and around. It shows the geography of the town, the sort of outskirts of it, which is where the story takes place primarily. It's on like an old road way out in the western side of Castle Rock.
Yeah.
You meet a lot of the characters. Sheriff Bannerman from the Dead Zone comes back again. And yeah, so this is like pure Maine. And it's based on an incident that happened to King when he was younger, and he had a car that broke down, and he took it out to this, out of town garage where he found out he could get his Pinto fixed for cheap, and this St. Bernard sort of challenged him, and that inspired him to write that book. And so once having established Castle Rock as a fictional place that he could sort of set strange occurrences, inexplicable occurrences in, he goes back to that well a number of times throughout the 70s. But by the end of the 70s, he was starting to think that it was a little bit too easy. Here was a place that, you just have to, say its name and you're already thinking weird stuff's going to happen. So he made a concerted plan to get rid of it.
Mm.
And it was a trilogy. So the first book was The Dark Half, was the first of the 3 books that he wrote that were going to spell the end of Castle Rock.
Okay.
And then Sundogs, which was part of 4 Past Midnight, sort of sets up, the town as it is in the late 80s. And then he said, okay, we're going to wipe it out with Needful Things, which was billed as the last Castle Rock novel. In a sense, that's not quite the case, because both Castle Rock and Derry suffered horrendous destructive incidents. The big fire in Castle Rock, the big flood in Derry. But that wasn't the end of the towns. They come back. There's a resurgence. They rebuild. So we do see quite a bit of Castle Rock again in Bag of Bones, for example. Mike Noonan, when he has to do his depositions, goes into the lawyers in Castle Rock. Then there's little bits and pieces. It gets mentioned from time to time. People drive through it. People drive past it. But then when Steve and Rich Chismar decided that they were going to do the Gwendy books, the first Gwendy book, it sort of reawakened King's interest in Castle Rock again. So yeah, we start with Gwendy's Button Box, to the extent that the next thing that King wrote was Elevation, which is set in Castle Rock. And by this point, Castle Rock is a pretty nice little place. It's got a place where the rich people live up on the hills. It's got a vegan Mexican restaurant. It's got an annual 8 or 10 or 12K race that people come from all across the country to participate in.
Okay.
So it's become quite prosperous and not quite as dark and seedy as it seems in the early stuff. And I think the main difference between Castle Rock and Derry is that Castle Rock has strange things going on, whereas Derry is a poisoned city. People who go there just feel the bad stuff that sort of percolates underneath the surface. And we see a little bit of that in 11/22/63 when the main character goes back to the time of it, and he just knows that this is a bad town. It doesn't just have bad people in it. There's something that makes bad people want to live here because it's just a poisoned city.
Yeah. Yeah, Derry does have a lot of malevolence there. I know that when I read Elevation, wasn't my favorite book, wasn't a bad book. It seems like King, with maybe some of his more recent works, he's really trying to kind of put his political philosophy and ideas into his books. It was really big in Billy Summers. And I don't care what an author's political, preferences are. It wouldn't make a difference to me if I was going to select one of their novels or not. That's something that I've detected. I detected it in Elevation, perhaps more than some of his other books. I'm just curious on Castle Rock. When I read Rita Hayworth in Shawshank Redemption for the first time, less than a year ago probably, where is that prison in the story? Because I think there's like some people would say maybe it's in Castle Rock, but I don't think that's right. But I think in the novel or the novella, there's kind of like a reference that like it's not far from Castle Rock. I'm just curious what your insight is on where the Shawshank Redemption prison is in the novella.
Yeah, they never really nailed down exactly where it is, but I would say that it's fairly close. And the Hulu series Castle Rock, which takes all sorts of liberties, it's not literal. Everything that happens in that series isn't taken directly from King, so they take some liberties. But it's a bit of a drive. Prisons tend to be, especially like a state prison, tend to be a little bit on the outskirts of things.
Yeah.
But I would say it's not in Castle Rock proper. Castle Rock is a little bit too small, I think, for that big of a building.
Right.
Like when you sort of get down to what Castle Rock is all about, Castle Rock has the central square, and most of the businesses are in like a 3-block square around that, and then there's the residential parts, but it doesn't really have a whole lot of like industry. I think there were some mills in the past and things like that, but it's a fairly small town. So I would say that Shawshank is close by.
I'm not sure if Stephen King ever tells us how Castle Rock actually gets started as a town. I know he tells us in the novel It exactly how Derry Maine gets started as a town, and we'll talk about that. What was I going to say about Castle Rock here? I just wanted to mention that before we move on to Derry, there are some some characters that cross over. Ace Merrill is one of the Castle Rock characters that crosses over. He's in Needful Things. He's also in The Body, which I kind of liked that he shows back up. Alan Pangborn is a sheriff that shows up in kind of multiple stories. I think he might play a part in The Dark Half, which was one of my least favorite Stephen King stories. But yeah, let's move on to Derry here. And maybe we'll come back to Castle Rock a little bit as we move on here. But when it comes to Derry Maine gets its start like this. And you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but there were some pilgrims from Derry, England, that kind of came over on a boat, and they settled Derry, and they called it Derry. They spelled it differently. And then those settlers at some point, this little settlement, I think everyone dies in it. That's like
they went away. They vanished.
They vanished. They
Yep.
vanished, right. No one knows where these people went. Gone. That's kind of like the first thing that happens in Derry, Maine history. That's always a question I try to get somebody on. If they say they're a huge Stephen King fan, I ask them, how did Derry, Maine get started? But anyway, in Derry, we have, of course, Stephen King's arguably his most famous novel, which is It. We have Insomnia. I have Bag of Bones down. I'm not sure if I made a mistake there or not. Dreamcatcher, part of 11/22/63, explores Derry, Maine. Secret Window, Secret Garden. Maybe you could just tell us what you know about Derry, Maine, and why Stephen King started writing in that realm, and maybe some about the books and how they connect.
Well, I mean, he actually, interestingly enough, he started working on it when he was not living in Bangor. He started when he was living in Colorado.
Was that the introduction of Derry, Maine? Was the novel It?
That's the introduction. Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. And so he had this vision of trip-tropping across the bridge with the troll living under the bridge. That was the sort of one of the inciting incidents in his mind that got him thinking about this book. And the incident that opens the novel with the murder on the bridge is based on a real incident that did happen in Bangor. And so I think it's only natural that if he was going to sort of link that incident to his book, that then the town that he creates for it should bear more than a passing similarity to Bangor. And so there are things like the canals that run through and under Bangor. Those become part of the geography of Derry. The Barrens is different. The Barrens is overlaid from a place he lived in. I can't remember now if it was Connecticut or somewhere else when he was a kid that they had the Barrens that they played in. So he sort of grafted those together. And the interesting thing, if you read back into like Mike the librarian from It, did a lot of research into the history of Derry, and he found the information that you talked about, the formation of the dairy company and the people that disappeared. And one of the interesting things that he found was that the town was built in the worst possible place it could have been, given the local geography, because of its tendency to flood. Floods happen in Derry every 30 or 40 or 50 years, and not just little floods, but ones that really wipe out the whole downtown, and it happens over and over again. The Native Americans who lived there before the dairy company started, they were smart, and they lived up on the sides of the hills around Derry. But that the people who established the town had the stupid idea to build the whole thing sort of right at the bottom where all the floodwaters basically get channeled to on their way out to the Atlantic Ocean. The people who founded Derry built it. It's not exactly on cursed land, but it was in the worst possible location because all of the floodwaters that run down the hills and come in from the surrounding areas, it was a recipe for disaster, and the disaster happens over and over again. And the culmination of the novel, It, is another one of these historic floods which washes away the entire downtown, basically carries it off into the Atlantic Ocean. But that's not the end for Derry. Derry gets rebuilt. Mike Noonan from Bag of Bones lives in Derry, and by that point, a number of years later, Derry is back to being, fully operational. They've reconstructed everything in the downtown. It's the same sort of cursed city that it always was. But interestingly, you mentioned Dreamcatcher. There is one scene in Dreamcatcher that takes place in Derry where the main character and his rather unusual passenger stop on the way through. And the plan was to do something with the water pipe, the standpipe in Derry, but what this unusual passenger doesn't realize is that the standpipe's gone, that it was washed away in the flood. So that sort of changes his plan, his scheme, and they have to move on. But they see when they're there a statue which is to the memory, or sort of a tribute to the kids from It, and then some graffiti that says Pennywise lives, which makes people think that maybe the old spider wasn't really dead and gone after all.
It's interesting because when I was kind of looking up some different topics to talk about this, and one of the things that I came across earlier today was a conversation on Core. I think, is Pennywise really dead? So It is really a good book for Stephen King connections. I don't know if it was like his 15th novel or something, but he had been writing for a while by the time he wrote It. Which came first, The Stand, or it was It that came?
No, the stand was in the 70s. It came out in the 80s.
Yeah. Okay. In It, I was really excited to find out that Christine makes an appearance. Toward the end of the novel, our characters have to get somewhere and they need a car. And in comes this Plymouth. And I was like, this is Christine. And Christine's malevolent influence wants to get in on all this fucked up shit that's happening on Derry. So she provides a ride. The turtle is in It as well, which is kind of a really bizarre part of the whole thing. In fact, in It, when it comes to just origins of the Stephen King multiverse, not just King starting writing, but the story itself of his multiverse, we get kind of conflicting stories with what the Dark Tower tells us happened, where Gan came along, he became the Tower, the beams came into play. This is the Stephen King multiverse. This is the origin of Stephen King's Maine and Derry and Castle Rock. But in It actually says that the turtle vomits out the world, as though the turtle were somehow the creator. But in the Dark Tower series, it says that Gan was the creator. And maybe I'm just confused here. I want to touch on this before we move on from the novel It. But
so I'm going to blow your head a little bit here.
Let me just read one paragraph before you do it. In the beginning, there was a magical presence known as the Prim, also referred to as darkness behind everything, in which Gan arose. When all world was created, Gan appeared in a metaphysical form as a giant edifice known as the Dark Tower, alongside 6 beams that are protected by 12 guardians, the turtle being one of those. It was said, actually, I'll stop it right there. So that's kind of like the lore to the Dark Tower series. So go ahead with what you were saying.
Okay, so there are books that take place in Derry, for example. Insomnia, let's take Insomnia as a good case. Insomnia appears literally, the book itself appears literally in the Dark Tower series. Somebody has a copy of it in their hands and they're looking at it and said, this is the most important Dark Tower, non-Dark Tower book that King has ever written.
Right.
But what you have to realize is that Insomnia is a book written by the Stephen King who appears in the Dark Tower series. So it is something that was channeled into him by Gan to write. But it's, I mean, I don't want to be too sacrilegious here, but it's biblical in the sense that it's inspired by
Right.
Gan, but it's not necessarily to be taken literally. So the things that happen with Patrick Danville, for example, in Insomnia.
That's how that plays into your kind of non-literal interpretation that it was an inspired kind of thing. I like how
Yeah.
you tied that together for me there, but
So,
continue,
so
please.
Patrick Danville in Derry doesn't really, you can't really draw a straight line between the one in Insomnia and the one in the Dark Tower series. The Patrick Danville in Insomnia was planted there as a clue to Roland and his people, that this is somebody who's going to be important to them. And so it's a metaphor, it's a symbol. And so whenever you run into any of these contradictions, you can always sort of hand wave them away by saying that this is something that's meant to mean something, but not necessarily be taken literally.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Can you touch on maybe the differences between what King says, how his world got started with Maturin vomiting out everything in it, and with the Dark Tower series? Is it just a lost in kind of translation there,
I
you
think
think?
that,
Or?
in the early 1990s, just about everything that King wrote was about the Dark Tower in one way or another. So he wrote things like Rose Matter. Rose goes through the painting into the land where they know about the prisoners hanging from Lud, and they know about Cod. And when Peter Straub and Steve wrote Black House, they explored the Crimson King. And I think in some ways, those books are ways that King is trying to work this stuff out for himself in his own mind before he brings it into the Dark Tower series. There are, writing experiments, there are explorations of the mythology. Because again, the things that happened in Black House, there's not a one-to-one correlation between the Crimson King as we know him or hear about him in Black House to what we find out about him in the Dark Tower books. I think they're just exploring and saying, who is this guy? What's this all about? And then once they get to a certain point, or he gets to a certain point, then he's ready to say, okay, now the gospel according to Roland, this is how things really happened.
Yeah.
That's just my interpretation of
it. Yeah, that is interesting, because maybe that is exactly what he was doing, where he was kind of just, formulating his ideas by writing a novel about something that's related before he goes and puts it in his magnum opus, which is The Dark Tower. We have some other novels in Derry Maine, of course, it being the most important and the most influential. Insomnia is big. Insomnia is a Derry Maine novel that's very tied in with The Dark Tower and what plays out in Insomnia. Patrick Danville is a recurring character, and we're going to talk about some recurring characters here. Bag of Bones, like you mentioned. Sacred Window, Secret Garden. For some reason, I didn't realize that one plays out there. I saw that on
it's sort of peripheral to it. Most of it takes place at this writer's house, which could basically be anywhere. So, I don't think that Derry or Castle Rock really feature into them all that intently.
Okay.
Just like Lacey's story as well. Scott Landon's when he becomes a writer, they live on Castle View, which is the ritzy part of Castle Rock. But those are, I think that's just incidental. If you live in Maine, you don't live too far from these places.
Yeah. Let's talk about the Tower, because the Tower really, or actually, you know what? Let's talk just quickly here about Ludlow, Maine, because Ludlow is another town that I wouldn't mind another novel taking place in. I really like Ludlow. Pet Sematary takes place in Ludlow. I think maybe The Dark Half is involved with Ludlow. I really like Pet Sematary and what's happening out at that old Micmac burial ground. I've read Pet Sematary since the last time we spoke. I really have a lot of questions about that Micmac burial ground and what the malevolent energy is out there that runs that. Is it just the Wendigo, or does it power the Wendigo? what's really going on out there at that burial ground. And you kind of get just a touch of history on it through Judd telling stories about the past in Pet Sematary. But I really like another novel that takes place maybe many years before in Ludlow that talks about what really happened out there. But maybe you can just tell us some on Ludlow. I know that it doesn't play in as permanently as, or as in, it doesn't have as much influence as Derry and Castle Rock and the Tower, but it is still kind of an important Stephen King location in Stephen King's Maine. So what do you know about Ludlow?
Well, I think it's important primarily because King was essentially living there. The pet cemetery is real. He moved into this house when he was writer in residence at the University of Maine. And he had a neighbor or multiple neighbors who told him about this pets cemetery. If you go to Bangor these days and you take Stu Tinker's tour of Bangor and Stephen King's Maine, they'll probably take you out and show you where the pets cemetery was, or maybe still is.
Yeah.
And there was an incident that happened while he was living there that really fueled the novel. The fact that his 2-year-old son at the time, Owen, was almost hit by a car or transport. You can see how that incident and the atmosphere of the area and the history of the pet cemetery, how all of those things basically crystallized into that novel. I think, you're talking about wanting to see more about what happened in the past. There are plans afoot to make we call it a sequel, but probably really a prequel to the most recent Pet Sematary movie.
The movie, yeah.
And that, I believe, based on everything I've heard about it, will be based on the story of Timmy Baterman, which is the story that Judd tells about what happened when he was a young man and somebody buried a person there and he came back. And I think that's the story we're going to find in this prequel follow-up movie that's coming down the pipe somewhere. But to go back further than that, I think you have to look again. It's just sort of folklore, and who do you believe, and who knows what's really real. And the Wendigo does make its presence known in much the same way that the creature in Booyah Moon makes itself known in Lisey's story. So the presence is there. So I think you have to say that type of spirit is probably, if not responsible, it's certainly involved in what's happening there. But can it inhabit multiple people? If you buried 6 people out there, would all 6 come back, or is there only one Wendigo? Or there's all sorts of things that you could play around with on that thing.
That's interesting because, whatever it is that's out there, it actually has the ability to reach across time and space and manipulate matter and energy. In Pet Sematary, I won't go on at length about it here, but in Pet Sematary, the wife of the guy, the doctor, is trying to come back. She's trying to come back. She's went out to her parents. She knows something's not right. She's got to drive a car, and it takes something apart on the battery of her car from 50 miles away. It doesn't want her interfering. So it's a competent consciousness that's out there that I would like to know more about. But you are right. They're making a preview on the movie. And I'm not big on movies. I don't watch a lot of movies. I might watch 2 a year. So I'm very limited on the movies that I've watched. We'll talk about the movies for a moment here. But
but you talk about this force working at a great distance to prevent something from happening.
Right.
That's very much analogous to there's the force of Ka in the Dark Tower, which is a force that's helping Roland and his quartet get where they want. But in 11/22/63, there's the force that is working against the main character to keep him from changing the past.
That's right.
And so there are elements that are bigger than humanity, which play with people like chess players, allowing them to do things, preventing them from doing things that seem to have a larger influence on what's happening in, quote unquote, the real world.
Those are 3 really good examples. And I had actually never really considered that beyond Ka, which is, we don't have to get into what exactly that is. Ka is like a destiny. It's almost like the laws of physics pushing things in a certain direction for a certain reason. And you can fight back against Ka, but it'll push back hard against you.
Yep. And there's a character who first comes up in Insomnia. His name is Dorrance Marsteller. And he is like an agent of Ka. He sort of wanders through the story, and he does things. He puts things in Ralph Roberts' pocket. He sort of gives him little hints about what's coming in. And he shows up in a couple of other stories as just like a free agent wandering around, meddling in things, but primarily seeming like an agent for good.
That's something that I never caught either. Even as someone who's really kind of passionate about this whole thing. Of course, I haven't completed every book yet, but I don't remember that from Insomnia. Insomnia is a novel I imagine that I would probably never read again because it was a really hard read for me for the most part. But maybe in time I could go back through that thing and kind of, of course, I read it years ago when I wasn't as knowledgeable as I am now. So maybe I would pick up on more if I read it again. Now, where was I? Okay, we're talking about Ludlow and Pet Sematary and the forest that reaches out. So there are a lot of like influences like that. I guess I hadn't really put a lot of thought into that. 11/22/63 would be a great book to reread because I remembered when you said that there were things that didn't want the past to be changed. But it's been a long time since I read it. So you have any more thoughts on that stuff? Because we'll move on to Richard Bachman here.
I had a thought and then it went away. So
if it comes back to you, let me know. Okay. We're going to get to the tower here, which ties all of this together. But before we get there, I want to talk about some recurring characters and, of course, Richard Bachman, which is a huge, important piece of the Stephen King multiverse. King, and maybe I've got this wrong, but I think at some point in his career he had some success. And he was wondering if maybe his stories weren't that great and people were just buying him because his name was out there. So he started writing some books under a different name to see if he could do well with those. And he did end up doing pretty well with those. I'm not sure the chronology of those, but we have Blaze, The Regulators, The Long Walk, The Running Man, Roadwork, Rage, which is a novel that's very out of print. And Richard Bachman was kind of his alter ego. It was his pen name. And of course, we constant readers, we really like Richard Bachman. And we've got to tread lightly here on some of this because I've read Blaze, which is kind of like Stephen King's tribute to Of Mice and Men, which I just loved, that damn Blaze. And he calls it like a trunk of the car novel, which I didn't get that from it. I really liked it. Like it was a damn good book, I thought. It seems like he has a lower opinion of that novel than I do. And I've also read The Regulators, which is a kind of sequel to Desperation. My next read by Stephen King, and probably my next read after I finish the first book in the Wheel of Time series, which I'm into now, will be The Running Man. So I'm finally going to crack that Bachman book collection open and read one of the stories that are in there with The Running Man. But tell us about Richard Bachman.
So you said you sort of gave a little bit of a backstory about why he did this. I mean, the first book that he ever submitted for publication really was called Getting It On. And the editor really worked with King a lot on that. And they almost sold it. And that was almost the first book that he had published. But ultimately, the publisher decided to pass on it. So that was sort of like a big disappointment. And so he followed up with The Long Walk and The Running Man and couldn't get any traction with those. And he finally struck gold with Carrie. And then, so he published a few novels in the 70s. And he had this idea that to sort of bring these books back to see, if there really were any good or not, and whether people would buy things that didn't have Stephen King's name on them.
Yeah.
His publisher, Doubleday, wasn't interested in publishing too many books by one author at the same time, because there was a belief at the time that you could saturate the market, that readers only had a certain number of dollars to spend on any given author, and if you hit them with too many books, that you would just sort of overwhelm them.
Yeah.
And so he went to the paperback publisher, who was really the one that made him a wealthy writer, when they gave him the huge advances for his the paperback versions of his early books. And he came up with this scheme to sort of publish these as paperback originals attributed to an unknown author to see, would they take off? And the reality is they did not.
Okay, they didn't do so
The
well.
first 4 books died on the vine. They just vanished.
Mm.
They showed up on the, like the supermarket spinner where the paperbacks are. They'd be there for a week or two and then they were gone. So Rage was the first one, which was getting it on. And the first 4 Bachman books, so Roadwork, Getting It On, Long Walk, Running Man, those 4 didn't make a huge bump. I think Rage got a review in maybe even in the New York Times. So they didn't disappear. They weren't completely invisible, but they just didn't. Richard Bachman wasn't going to be retiring as a wealthy writer.
Yeah.
Until Thinner came along. And with Thinner was a recent book. King wrote that one in the 80s, unlike the other books which had been written in the like early 70s. And so it was a contemporary novel. He had the experience of writing all these books. And the publisher had so much faith in the book that they released it as a hardcover. And it did reasonably well. It sold like 30,000 copies. But that was the time when this guy went digging around in the Library of Congress records, and he found the copyright information on the first 4 books, and he found that the first one was registered. He could connect it to King.
Mm-hmm.
And so he sent a letter off, and King said, "Yeah, that's the smoking gun, the magic bullet." And yeah, okay. And so this guy wrote an article for the Washington Post, I believe, telling the history of Richard Bachman, and instantly Thinner went from being the 30,000 hardcover to being 300,000 copy hardcover.
Yeah.
And then the story was on Good Morning America and in the Bangor Daily News, and that was it. So, and that was really what fired King up to write The Dark Half, because he was a little bit annoyed that his little pet project got taken away from him, and so he sort of poured that into The Dark Half, where the reporter suffers a pretty brutal fate at the hands of his pseudonym.
Yeah.
And so that was his response to it. But he came to realize that there were certain things that he wrote in a Richard Bachman mindset. And the books are almost all bleak, downbeat. They don't end well for anybody. And to that extent, they're a little bit different from the typical Stephen King novel where, people can have a more or less okay, happy ending. Not always, Pet Sematary being an example. But I think once you crack the pages of a Bachman book, things are going to get serious, and they're just not going to get much better all the way along.
That's really interesting because, I maybe I don't know about it because I've kind of intentionally stayed away from too much Bachman book, commentary and whatnot, because I still have to read the novels. But so when he wrote The Dark Half, was that him kind of putting a rest to Richard Bachman then at that point?
He actually entertained the idea of publishing that book as being co-written by Stephen King and Richard Bachman. His publisher didn't get on board with that, so it's a Stephen King novel. But really, he had Richard Bachman in mind. And another book that could have been a Bachman novel was Misery.
Oh, that's right. He didn't write The Dark Half as Richard Bachman. I don't know why I was thinking that. But what about Misery?
But he wrote Dark Half as Richard Bachman, thinking that Richard Bachman's name was going to appear on the cover with his name too.
Okay, I see.
But the publishers thought that would be too confusing, and they decided that that wouldn't happen. But that would have been pretty cool. It would have been. And then he has often talked, long ago, more than recently, about writing one of the books that's written by George Stark in The Dark Half, the Steele's Machine novel that the pseudonym is attributed to in The Dark Half. He's thought, I could write Machine's Way, but that's never happened. But so there is some crossover between what King thinks of as his own work and what he thinks of as Richard Bachman.
Is there any other like crossover between the Bachman books? Of course, we know that the Regulators is kind of a sequel to Desperation, so there's a huge crossover there between, you know, Richard Bachman and Stephen King. You know, co-writing a two-piece like that. Is there anything else you can think of before we move on from Bachman, where there's really kind of like a good amount of overlap with maybe some of his later works or anything like that?
I think anybody now who's read the body of King's work, who stumbled across the Bachman books without knowing who they were written by, would see some things in them that would say, you know, that sounds an awful lot like. So the blue ribbon laundromat appears in Roadwork, and that's something that comes back again in later King things.
Let me ask you this, because you said that he didn't originally intend to write The Dark Half with just Richard Bachman's name on it. Was that his intention?
I think he intended it for it to be co-written.
A co-written, okay. Because I was going to say that would be kind of weird, because like Castle Rock shows up in it, everything. It would be almost like he was blowing his own cover.
Well, by that time the cover had been blown.
Ah, okay, yeah, okay, I see.
The cover got blown in '84 or '83 with Thinner, and so you know, when he wrote the Regulators, everybody knew that Richard Bachman was Stephen King when the Regulars came out, and it came out on the same day as Desperation.
Oh, okay.
And the original, you could buy the bundle, and if you take the covers of the original Viking publications, they join up to make a larger picture. And and they've got the same characters. Yep, that's it.
Okay, we were on with Richard Bachman here.
Yeah, and of course they've got the same characters. They're just, or at least
right.
the same named characters. Sometimes they're in different relationships or doing different things. Right. He referred to it as sort of like a repertory theater, where you've got this cast of actors who are playing Macbeth in the morning and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest in the afternoon. You know,
Tack is involved as well in both novels, isn't that right? That Tack comes into play.
Yeah, it is, definitely. Yeah.
You know, so I'm really looking forward to actually finishing those Bachman books up. You know, I asked myself the other day, why haven't I finished the Stephen King catalog? It's been many years now. I'm really passionate about his books. You know, I've reread The Gunslinger. I've read it 4 times. I've read The Drawing of the Three 4 times. Those are the only 2 Stephen King books that I've actually done a reread on. But I think like maybe subconsciously I've been avoiding it. You know, I've only been allowing one here and there, because what am I going to do when I finish the Stephen King catalog? You know what I mean?
He's still alive. He's still writing. There's going to be another book coming out this year, or 2 more this year, probably.
Yeah. Of course, the last piece with Richard Chizmar has to come out. Boy, Richard Chizmar really hit the jackpot managing to write those books with Stephen King. You know, Stephen King really likes him a lot. And Richard Chizmar has done a lot for writing. I imagine Stephen King probably kind of looks up to him for that. You know, Richard Chizmar is really passionate about writing. We'll talk about him and you here in a moment when we go on to, you know, other authors that play in. But Richard Bachman's very important. I can't wait to read the rest of the novels, but we'll move on since I haven't read them. I just want to mention quickly here the hard case crime novels. We don't have to get into, you know, everything King did. And then we'll talk about recurring characters. We'll move on to The Dark Tower and we'll finish it up. But I like these hard case crime novels. I read Joyland a little over a year ago. I thought it was an okay book. I wasn't huge on it. I thought that it kind of came up empty at the end with the whole mystery that was going on. Then I read The Colorado Kid, a book that I expected I would not enjoy. I did not expect to enjoy it, and I put it off for years because of that. And I actually liked The Colorado Kid. I really liked it. And I want to ask you about how it ends here. And I haven't read later yet. I'm actually learning Spanish right now. It's been almost 5 months of studying Spanish every day. And one of my kind of mid to long range goals is to read a novel in Spanish. And that novel will be Later by Stephen King. I'm going to read it in Spanish. You know, what I got from Joyland and The Colorado Kid is it's kind of a more, I don't know if lighthearted is the right word, but they're not the most sophisticated stories that were ever written with huge, you know, big words in them. So I think Later would kind of fit in with, you know, relatively easy novel, but I don't want to talk too much about it because I haven't read it. But Of course, in the Colorado Kid, we're on the islands of Stephen King's Maine and everything. There's some suggestion that maybe the Colorado Kid went through a door to get from Denver out to Maine so fast. So it kind of plays into the Dark Tower, and Jack Sawyer has this ability to hip hop around and everything. So I'm just curious what you think about those hard case crime novels, and how they play into the other works of Stephen King.
So the Colorado Kid originated because hard case crime started this imprint of paperback classic noir detective novels, and they approached Steve and asked if he would give them a blurb for their launch, because King is a huge crime fiction fan, and he has written a lot of crime fiction over the years, especially in his short stories. A lot of his very early short stories are not supernatural. There's some very straight, like The Wedding Gig, and there's a whole series.
That's a really good one.
There's a whole series of those things. And so he said, no, I don't think I'll write you a blurb. I think I'll write you a book. And so he wrote The Colorado Kid, knowing full well that it was not going to really mesh completely well with the line, because it's not really a noir story per se. And people are frustrated. They get to the end and say that, well, he doesn't solve the mystery. How many times?
That's the best part.
But how many times does he have to tell the readers through the book that we're talking about a great unsolved mystery?
Yeah.
Before he realized there's no solution to this mystery.
Yeah.
And to a way, it reminded me of From a Buick 8, in the sense that it's dealing with something that happens to ordinary people that there is no rational explanation for, and at the end of the day it's gone, and there's just that thing happened and we just can't explain it. But the supernatural elements to that book are very subtle. That's like, well, maybe this happened, maybe kind of. And then when you move on to the book Choo in the hard case series, Joyland, it's much more overt. This is a ghost story. And it's pretty clear that he's going down that road. And without spoiling later, right out of the gate, this is a horror novel. And the character says that, in the preamble, you said this is a horror story.
Interesting.
And you're in for some real treats, for connections between that book and the rest of King's. Some of the things we've talked about already feature very prominently in that novel. But it is full on supernatural, little boy can see dead people kind of thing.
Yeah.
There's no question about that. And so a similar trajectory takes place in his 3 Mercedes novels. Mr. Mercedes is straight on non-supernatural crime story. By the end of Finders Keepers, we get the hint that there's maybe something a little bit weird going on that defies normal explanation. And then you get into End of Watch, and we're into full-on supernatural territory again. So he's got this sort of, we're going to ease you into it in my mystery series trajectory that he does twice with those series.
King's really gotten into writing those crime stories, like whole novels. Like you said, he's written a lot of short stories that are crime fiction themed. He did the Mr. Mercedes. He did The Outsider, which is kind of tacked on to that. The hard case crime. It's really weird that he would write a horror novel for that hard case crime. Now I'm really interested. I'll have to really pick up on my Spanish lessons so I can get to that damn book.
And then we get into Billy Summers, which is 99.9% straight crime, except he just happens to end up in Sidewinder, Colorado, and looking out across the chasm at this, the ruins of this old hotel that there's all sorts of stories about. And he's working in a cabin where, there's this picture of the hotel that, he can't quite, it looks a little bit different. The hedge animals look a little bit different. So there's just that, because we exist in this world where those things happen. Just like in Dr. Sleep, ultimately you have to go back to this place where those weird things happened. And it's all part of the history of what happens in that one version, I would say, of Stephen King universe.
I want to talk about Billy Summers here, but I want to go back to the Colorado Kid just quickly here, because I'm curious now that I have you here. in the Colorado Kid, there's an unsolved mystery. This guy, he goes from Denver, Colorado, out to Maine. He gets there like really quickly, like it's just almost barely possible that he could have traveled this much distance. He has cigarettes in his pocket that come from Denver. He has an unusual coin, like a foreign piece of currency
Russian
in his
coin.
a Russian coin. He's choked in a way that seems maybe there's something fishy going on. Maybe there's not. He's dead. And I didn't really see as much after I finished it. I thought it was a good book, but I was reading on it afterward, and I started reading these conspiracy theories and everything. And it became apparent that maybe the Colorado Kid stepped through a door, like what would be used in the Dark Tower series, to travel to Maine. Now, that doesn't entirely make sense, because when Roland uses a door, it goes some other multiverse. It doesn't take him within his own realm. So I don't know if that could really work. Someone else said Jack Sawyer has the ability to kind of jump around, but Jack Sawyer goes somewhere else. He doesn't open up a portal to his own, world. So I'm just curious, and you don't have to go on at length, what you think happened with the Colorado Kid.
Well, there are different kinds of doors. There are magic doors, which happen, naturally, I will say. And then there are the mechanical doors that Lamerck Industries and Somber Corporation built to allow transportation from place to place.
Yes.
There are doors like the one in the Jaunt, which lets you travel from one planet to another across the universe. They put you to sleep and you wake up in another planet. So there are all sorts of doors that have different characteristics. Now, why there should happen to be one in Colorado that takes you to Maine, why the Colorado Kid wanted to go to Maine, or maybe he didn't even know where he was going when he went through the doorway. Those are all unanswered questions, but they're fun to speculate about.
It makes me
Now,
wonder.
the sci-fi TV series took the story of Colorado Kid and turned it into a 6-season TV series.
What? I've got to check that out. I didn't know about that one.
It's called Haven, Haven, which is the name of the town in the Tommyknockers, but they're not connected. And it's basically an X-Files type series that occasionally touches back on the death of the Colorado Kid. But if you want a series which is like the Easter egg trove of all troves of Stephen King Easter eggs, every episode of Haven has at least one, if not multiple, Easter eggs that refer to something from the Stephen King universe. The guy, one of the consultants on it, was Charles Ardai, who is the founder of Hard Case Crime.
And that's one thing that's so important with the theme of this video, about how much crossover there's. And we're going to talk specifically about movies for just a moment. But for example, in the 11/20/263 television program thing, the Randall Flagg shows up in that on a bicycle. I'm not sure if you caught that. You probably did, but he comes kind of crashing through. So there's like all these different little pieces and parts that are just sprinkled all over the place. And I want to talk about Billy Summers as well. But one more question on the Colorado Kid. As Stephen King was writing that, and he was putting the coin into the cigarettes, do you think he specifically had an answer for that mystery, or do you think he was just kind of playing with some things to make it mysterious? Like if we asked him what happened, could he tell us exactly what happened, or is maybe he not even sure?
I would say he would say that he's not sure because he hasn't written that yet, and to find things out, he has to write them.
Fair enough.
I mean, he has started. He said one of the reasons why he's never really written an Agatha Christie type novel is because in those sorts of whodunits, you really need to know how it's all going to end before you start. And for him, it's mostly writing to find out what happened. And I think if he got to the end of the Colorado Kid and didn't have an idea of exactly what happened, to him, that was the point. And I don't think that he probably has explored beyond that, and I doubt that he will.
Yeah, that's kind of where I was going with it. I really wondered, did he have something in his mind about where that coin came from? Because that was probably the most perplexing clue, and that was that damn coin. I was wondering if King really had something behind that, or if he was just maybe playing with us with that. But you know what?
There might have been something that happened. Very often something happens in your life that makes you think to add these things. some, maybe he went to the store one day and came home with a pocket full of change and found a Russian coin among his change.
Yeah.
And he said, "Oh yeah, that's interesting. Let's put that. That's mysterious. Where did that come from?
Yeah.
Let's put that in there because it really does make it even more mysterious."
It's interesting when you read a novel, especially if you read, multiple works by an author. You can oftentimes get a sense of who they are, not just because of what they're directly saying, but a person their personality kind of plays into the story in ways that maybe they don't even intend. You might realize something about your favorite author that they didn't even really mean for you to pick up on, which is a lot of fun.
That's what this book is about. The Stephen King Illustrated Companion. So in this book, I take a good cross section of King's books, and not only talk about the books, I talk about what was going on in his life when he wrote them, and what inspirations came into the books from things that were part of his real life. So, for instance, Lisey's story. That story was inspired by the fact that he became deathly sick a couple of years after his accident, almost died from pneumonia.
Yeah.
While that happened, his wife decided she's going to refurbish his office at home. She hasn't finished when he's released. He comes home to find that everything's all boxed up, and he thinks it's just like I died. And then so he said, okay, what happens to the author's wife when the author dies?
Yeah.
And so his real life experience translates into and becomes, hugely fictionalized in one of his books. And that happens quite frequently to some degree or other in many of his works.
Yeah, I really liked that Lisey story. I haven't watched the television show of it, but I know that the book, and here's a good, kind of idea about how his works will overlap, even between the books and the movies. In Lisey's story, one of the characters has a copy of Charlie the Choo-Choo, which is a children's book that Stephen King wrote. So, and it goes even a step further, because Charlie the Choo-Choo, which I can grab with these headphones on, this book is a very special children's book, because this book shows up in another Stephen King book, In the Wastelands by Stephen King. I think it's Jake is in a bookstore, Calvin Tower. He finds this exact book.
The Manhattan Museum of the Mind. Yep.
The Manhattan Museum of the Mind. He literally finds this exact book. And I think that the text of this is actually in that book.
Yeah. Wasteland. And that book was created as a San Diego Comic-Con promo for the Dark Tower movie.
And that's, it's just an example of how there are these things that work back and forth in Stephen King's works. In King's works, there are a lot of characters that are in one book, and they'll show up in another, and then they'll show up in another. Then they're in a short story. Then they show up in a novella years later. I just have a list here. We don't have to go on at length here with these, but Randall Flagg may be the most recurring character. He's in the Tower series. He's in The Eyes of the Dragon. And we're going to talk about the Tower series to finish this conversation off here in a moment. But, Christine makes at least 3 appearances, I believe, including in her own book. Dick Halloran. I was so excited when I read it. And there was Dick Halloran there at that club. And he might even show up in Dr. Sleep. I'm not sure if that's right.
He does, and he also shows up in Joe Hill's Nosferatu.
I would have had to have caught that when I read Nosferatu, and maybe I did and I've forgotten it, because I read Nosferatu, which I really liked. I thought that was probably the best book that I've read by Joe Hill. I read The Fireman also, which I didn't like it as much. Horns was pretty good too. But Maturin, the turtle, is another one that shows up. She was in it. She's in the Dark Tower series, plays a very important role. Gaon is very important. Is kind of the overseer of the whole Stephen King multiverse with the Tower and Insomnia. Probably comes into play maybe in Black House. Low Men in Yellow Coats, but maybe just talk to us a bit about King's characters, maybe how he kind of got started with that whole thing and whatnot.
Well, I mean, there's sort of a natural progression for people who live in the same town that they'll show up from time to time. So, for example, Ralph Roberts from Insomnia shows up in Bag of Bones. He has a little conversation because they live in the same town.
Right.
And the sheriffs in Castle Rock there's a whole continuity of the sheriffs, because one sheriff's term ends in one book for one reason or another, and his replacement comes in, and he sort of escorts the town through a couple of books, and then he meets, either retires or is retired, and then the next guy comes along, and so those names pop up from time to time. But there's also the characters that King wondered about what happened to them. And so people always asked him, when are you going to write a sequel to Salem's Lot? And he said, Salem's Lot, we pretty much put an end to it. But, I've always been curious about what happened to Father Callahan after he got on the bus and left town.
Yeah.
And all these years later, we find out what happened in great detail. And then people say, well, what happened to Danny Torrance? After his horrible experience in the Overlook Hotel. Mm-hmm. And he used to joke and say, yeah, he and Charlie McGee met up and they got married, and said you wouldn't believe the kids that they produced. Mm-hmm. But he said he found himself from time to time wondering what happened to Danny, until ultimately he decided it was time to revisit Danny as an adult, to see how, what a clusterfuck his life had been, basically, and how he sort of redeems himself, I guess, puts himself back together again, and has a better resolution to that story. But then we've got characters who have powers, who are obvious targets of the low men, who get conscripted into becoming breakers from various books.
Right.
Ted Brautigan from Low Men in Yellow Coats, Dinky Earnshaw from Everything's Eventual. The Dark Tower series, in a way, is almost like Old Home Week for King, because there are a lot of characters from many of his different books who show up for the grand finale. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why I wrote The Road to the Dark Tower, was because that series has so many tendrils that go into all of the other books, that it was a manageable way to look at the big picture of the Stephen King universe in a manageable small book, without it ending up being 12 volumes of the Stephen King universe.
Right. I'm looking forward to getting through some this year. By the end of 22, there won't be many Stephen King stories left that I haven't read. I'm really looking forward to getting there, because then I can get into some more of your books. I can get into that Stephen King and philosophy without really, worrying about spoiling the plots of these. I have a feeling Gerald's Game is going to be a pretty tough read for me, even without knowing what happens in that one. But I know Sleeping Beauties is going to be a hard read for me. That was a book that I read like literally 75% of before I put it down. I've got to start it over again. At this point, I'm also going back through, because there were some Stephen King books that I gave up on over the years that I just wasn't into. Cujo is an example. But I'm now coming back to some of those and reading them. And it's interesting what a change of time and perspective can do for you, because I gave up on The Stand years ago. And when I went to reread it in 2021, I actually enjoyed it. And I didn't think I was going to. I had given up on it years ago. I actually enjoyed it when I went back through it about a year ago or so. So, change of time, change of perspective can take a piece of artwork that maybe you wouldn't have enjoyed as much. And I don't know, maybe through your own maturity, or maybe your taste have changed a little bit. You might enjoy it a little more now than you were capable of then. But when it comes to recurring characters, I forget, I was going somewhere with that, but it's one of the best, it's one of the more fun things about reading Stephen King's works, because you read a book and you come to like a character. You never imagine that you're going to come back to them at some point in the future, and then kind of unexpectedly you pick up a novel and here comes the person back in, and you learn something more about them. And that becomes kind of special to someone that enjoys reading novels. And then you read a short story years later and here they're back again. You find out where they came from in the beginning. That can be a lot of fun. And I think that's really part of the allure of Stephen King's bibliography overall, is that there are so many, not only events that are influencing other things, but characters are coming in. And it's just fun to read about those people and keep track of them over their lives at different points. It's one of my favorite things. Let's talk about a few just independent pieces, then we'll tie all this up with The Dark Tower. I also want to talk about other authors, so we'll do this really quickly here. Let's go into other authors. Joe Hill writes in Stephen King's Maine. I found it in Horns, where I was reading Horns, and like they reference Castle Rock or something, like Castle Rock's not far out. And I'm thinking, they're actually writing in Stephen King's Maine, Joe Hill. And he does that in most of his books, I think. I think that's true in The Fireman as well. It obviously is in Nosferatu with the Dick Halloran thing. But Richard Chizmar writes in Castle Rock without Stephen King, because the second Gwendy's books, it's just Richard Chizmar writing on his own. Peter Straub writes a part of the tower in Black House. And I really liked when I read Different Seasons, that last one, Winter's Tale. When you start the Winter's Tale, it says it's dedicated to Peter Straub, and it really gives a similar feel to Ghost Story. And there's a lot to consider when that kind of relatively short story finishes. A very haunting type story. I love that one. It was probably my favorite in the collection, was A Winter's Tale.
The breathing method.
The breathing method. The breathing method. The breathing method. A Winter's Tale is a different one. Which one is A Winter's Tale?
It is The Winter's Tale. That was of the season.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah. Because there's two different titles for each story in that. But Robin Firth kind of plays into this, where she writes the Stephen King Dark Tower Companion, or the Concordance, actually, where, you know, she's kind of playing into this thing too. And you even show up basically as a character in one of his stories. So maybe you can elaborate just a little bit on everything that I just said about other authors that are actually a part of this thing.
Well, Robin actually also has written a fair amount of Dark Tower material, because she scripted the Marvel graphic novels, and so she was allowed to expand on, especially Roland's childhood, things that, you know, aren't written in any of the King novels. But yeah, so I mean,
are those considered canon? Those Dark Tower graphics? I've only read one so far.
Oh. Canon light, perhaps.
Okay.
Quasi-canonical. Because, you know, one thing that they address is the battle at Jericho Hill, for example. Yeah. And King has said that's one of their series that he does not want to read, because he has his own vision of what happened at Jericho Hill, and he might decide to write that someday, and he doesn't want to be influenced by what they did in the graphic novels. But you can't just write in somebody else's universe. You have to get permission to do so. So the fact that...
Is that a legal matter, or just like an ethical matter?
Well, it's ethical, but it's legal. I mean, that's their intellectual property.
I didn't know that.
You can't use their characters. You can't... I mean, fan fiction really treads the line on that. You know, people say, well, I'm not getting paid for it. Well, that doesn't matter, really. You know, Disney really cracks down on people who tries to use licensed characters. So yeah, you can't just go do that. Rich got invited into that world when Steve had this story that he didn't know how to finish, and he and Rich were talking back and forth about collaborations. And Rich originally, I think, had pitched the idea of doing a round robin one, which is where you have a whole series of writers and everybody writes a bunch and then just passes it on to the next person. And Steve said that didn't interest him too much, but he said, you know, I've got this thing that I can't figure out how to finish, and it'll never get published. So here it is, you know, do with it if you think you can do something with it. And so then they went back and forth, and they finished Gwendy's Button Box. And a couple of years later, Rich had an idea. He said, you know, I think I know what happens to Gwendy at some point in her future, and I'd like to explore that. Now, are you interested? And at the time, Steve was in the middle of a novel, and he said, you know, great idea. Go ahead and run with it. And Steve's collaboration on that one was limited to doing a sort of an editing pass on the manuscript, just to sort of smooth things out and, you know, address any historical aberrations or things like that. And then it was Steve himself who, a couple of years after that, said, you know, let's go back to Gwendy again. And he and Rich have written Gwendy's Final Task, which will be coming out next month, I believe.
Yeah, you know, I did an interview with Richard Chizmar on the first Gwendy's. It wasn't a huge thing, but it was actually his most watched interview on YouTube. So he's agreed to come back and talk about that third one as well. But I just think that it's interesting. You know, well, let me ask you this about that intellectual property thing. Let's say that King passes away. Is there like a certain amount of time that goes by where you can't? Because I know like a lot of people have written in the Sherlock Holmes
Yeah, there is a
universe.
certain amount of time, but it's a lot of
Okay.
time.
Okay.
And
What?
the estate can renew the copyrights. And so, like, I think Agatha Christie's first novel is out of copyright, but the
Okay.
rest of her books are still in. And most of Sherlock Holmes is out of copyright, but the last 2 stories are still within the copyright. It was like 75 years or something like that.
Okay.
So nobody can write about things that happened to Sherlock Holmes during his retirement years, for example.
Okay.
But
I've
on the other hand, when we did Flight or Fright, we could take one of Arthur Conan Doyle's, it was a non-Sherlock Holmes story, and we could just include it in the anthology without getting any clearances on it because it's in the public domain by that point.
right. So it's technically your own property if you want to use it, if that's the case.
People could bind it in hardcovers and sell it on eBay or Amazon if they wanted
Right.
to, and do. And that happens a lot with books that have gone out of copyright.
Before we move on to the tower, I just want to mention that Billy Summers book again, because I said I wanted to come back to that. In Billy Summers, there's a lot of Stephen King really kind of plays on his other works in that. And I was wondering if he would. I didn't expect him to go to the extent that he did. And I kind of enjoyed that. But my favorite thing in that wasn't anything about the tower. It wasn't even the stuff with the Overlook Hotel, which is what he really goes on about in that, is the Overlook. And the piece of artwork that's changing, and it won't stay down if you take it down, it's back up on the wall. But toward the end of the novel, I was reading, and the characters come to an underpass, and I thought to myself, this is the same underpass that's in The Stand. And I looked it up on my phone, and I said, okay, it is. And as they were going, I thought to myself, they're following the same route, generally speaking, that the characters followed in The Stand. And then they end up at Mother Abigail's house and the cornfield and everything. That was my favorite reference in Billy Summers, where they were actually kind of, I don't know if technically speaking they follow the exact same route, but like they're following the same route as some of those characters followed in The Stand. They end up at the same place. Which was like a midway point in The Stand, to go pick up Mother Abigail. I think they actually go into her home. Hemmingford home is where they end up. But I thought that that was really neat with Billy Summers. I really liked that. Wasn't my favorite novel by a long shot. I thought it was all right and everything. It really made me think about, sometimes shit like that really does happen. It makes me, I actually thought to myself, was Jeffrey Epstein the inspiration for this novel? But it says that King actually started writing like a month or 2 before, because he tells you when he started writing it on the very last page. It'll say Stephen King, to July 20, 2007 to August 2010 or whatever. And he actually started writing that book like 2 months before Jeffrey Epstein was arrested again.
There's lots of people like that and that we've encountered over the years to serve as that sort of inspiration. For me, one of the most interesting parts about that book was it's another way that King analyzes what writing is all about. And as Billy starts off writing his memoir, having to write it from the point of view of a different persona because he's trying to fool the people who are watching him, but then gradually working his way into finding his own voice, deciding things like, how much detail do you have to put into something like this? Do I need to give them all of the meticulous detail about the ammunition and the guns and all that, or can I just sort of fake my way through it? And, the truth inside the lie, inside the truth of writing. For me, that as a writer, that was a fascinating part of that book.
For me, as someone who's starting to become a writer, I like that as well. Now, when I say I'm becoming a writer, I have kind of like a plan for my life where I want to go. And I've realized that I really need to start writing about what I want to do to achieve my goals. I'm reading a book now called The Power of Writing It Down. It's all about, I'm going to make this library I'm in much nicer. I'm going to get a nice rug in here. The lady suggests making a very comfortable environment for yourself to do some writing in. And I'm just going to be journaling about my life is the writing I'm talking about. I'm becoming someone who's going to write a little bit more to help me achieve my goals. But I like that in Billy Summers, where he's kind of going through the process of someone who's doing this for the first time. That's basically writing an autobiographical account. And I just thought that was very interesting. And by far, that was my favorite part of the book, was his looking back on the past and what happened in Iraq and what happened when he was a child. That part of the narrative was a 10 for me. The rest of the novel, maybe not so much. And another thing that really hit me with Billy Summers is like shit like that really happens sometimes. There really is like a criminal underground where millionaires can occasionally make something happen that you or I might not be able to. I just thought it was kind of a good idea. I don't know, but it really seemed like that Jeffrey Epstein thing. You know, how much money would you and influence would you really have to kill someone that's in jail? You know what I mean? I thought it was interesting. But let's talk about this tower here and wrap this thing up, because this is really the most important part of everything that we've talked about, because Stephen King's magnum opus is The Dark Tower. And there are a lot of constant readers that actually haven't read the Dark Tower series. I always encourage them to do it, but it seems like everything comes back to this tower in some way. You know, there's a story that plays out in the Dark Tower novels, and the Tower series itself influences some non-Stephen King works in very serious, influential ways a lot of times. And then sometimes it's more of a lighthearted connection where, you know, we hear about a gunslinger or, you know, where the Gerard Tower or something like that comes up, where it's just kind of a minor thing. It doesn't really influence the plot a whole lot, but, you know, it's still kind of interesting to read about as someone who likes this kind of thing. But that Dark Tower is kind of the linchpin, so to speak, of the entire Stephen King multiverse. Everything with Castle Rock, everything with Derry, all of the short stories, maybe even the nonfiction, if you want to go there, somehow comes back to this Dark Tower. So tell me what you think about the importance of the tower and related to maybe even, you know, non-Dark Tower works.
Well, I mean, he started working on the Dark Tower, on the Gunslinger, the first book of the Dark Tower, when he was still in college. And he didn't finish the 7-book series until the 21st century. And so it's something that has been with him throughout the vast majority of his writing career. And he has still even returned to it off and on since he finished the series proper. There's an 8th book, The Wind Through the Keyhole. There are stories and novellas that are clearly Dark Tower influenced, stories like where some low men wander in at the end of the thing and help put the story back on its proper road again. And so, yeah, I think probably that by we I mean the constant readers, think more about this consciously than he does.
Yeah.
I believe that a lot of this for him is innate. It's just comes to him out of the ether and, you know, flows through him like the winds of Gan and the creativity and all that. Because I don't think he's as deliberate about it sometimes as critics or even people like myself, you know, assign to him. He says that he's very much that he doesn't have a plan when he sets out to write a book, and sometimes the books take him in directions different than what he intended. And so, you know, I don't think he ever really knew what was going to happen in the Dark Tower series when he was writing The Gunslinger, for example. He had some sort of vague idea, and he admitted that he even had a bit of an outline, which he lost at some point early on. But he said that was probably for the best, because he said the outline was probably crap. And he doesn't work from outlines, and he likes to be more intuitive about how he does things. And but obviously, clearly during the 1990s, it was on his mind a lot. He was writing, mainstream non-Dark Tower books that were infused with Dark Tower references, while he was trying to work up courage to get back into the series with the 4th book. There was a long hiatus between the 3rd and 4th books, but he wasn't neglecting Roland and the story. He was thinking about it a lot. And then, after his accident happened, I think he was a little bit taken aback by, one of the reactions that he got from people was, "Oh, we're so glad you didn't die, because then we would never have found out how the series ended." And so I think that was one of the motivators for him to sit down and just sort of hammer out the rest of the series, back to back. And because, his office staff, the number one FAQ they always got over the years was, when was the next Dark Tower book going to come out? And, they used to get these amusing things. Somebody sent them a Polaroid of a teddy bear in chains, and they said, write the next book or the teddy bear dies.
Yeah.
Even though there's a large segment of his readership who haven't read the series, the segment who have become very, very devoted fans and very determined to see it through to the end. And, finally we've gotten to the end. The question of whether he will ever go back and write something again, I think part of what got him to do the Wind Through the Keyhole was that there was a story in Roland's youth that he wanted to revisit. And when I was working on the Dark Tower Companion, my second Dark Tower book, there was a detail that had come up when I was working on The Road to the Dark Tower that I asked him about directly when I was working on it. And there's a scene where in Mages, where or before Roland gets sent away, when he's talking to his father, where Roland's father looks at him and thinks in his mind about his son, the one who had survived.
Yes.
And so
it has to have a sibling.
So I asked King, what's the deal? What's going on here?
Yeah.
Does he have siblings? And King said, yes, he does. Will you tell me more about them? No, I won't. So flash forward a bunch of years when I'm working on the Dark Tower Companion. I actually interviewed him properly for that book. There's the interviews included in that book. And I tried to dig something more out of him again. And I said, what can you tell me about it? And he said, yes, Roland had a brother and a sister. And he gave me the sister's name. And he said, the person who knows that story is Evelyn, the woman who ran the monastery where Gabrielle Deschênes was sent when she was sent away for a while. And he said, Evelyn knows a lot about that family. And he said, maybe someday I'll go back and write about that.
I was watching not long ago. It looked like it was an interview that was relatively recently, like maybe 2018 or something like that, maybe several years ago, where King was answering some questions after a talk, and somebody said, will there be anything more about the Dark Tower? And he said, I think that there might be. And for the life of me, I can't tell you exactly how far back that interview was, but I'm pretty damn sure it was like post Wind Through the Keyhole. So
he has said that. I think you never really know about these things. There was just before he wrote The Wind Through the Keyhole, he held a referendum on his website. And he said, I've got two ideas that I'm thinking about working on. One is a new Dark Tower novel, and the other is the sequel to Salem's Lot. Sequel to The Shining.
Yeah.
And so he asked people, which one would you rather I work on first? And so he got like thousands and thousands of votes, and it was almost split 50-50. Maybe a slight edge towards what ultimately became Dr. Sleep.
Yeah.
But at the time he said, I know what happened to Danny. But he said, maybe the time has passed. Maybe too much time has passed. I'm not sure that I'll ever write that.
Yeah.
But then he did. So I think, from year to year and decade to decade, inspiration happens as inspiration happens. And he has said that he would be interested in exploring the Battle of Jericho Hill, maybe, what happened with... And he seems more interested in Roland's youth. Because I don't think that there's much to be told beyond the end of Book 7 of the Dark Tower.
Yeah.
So it would have to be sort of backstories, the incidents that happened in Roland's past.
Well, the only thing that there would be to be told about with the Dark Tower would be and I'm pretty sure that he's put a rest to that when he published the Dark Tower. It was at rest. But what happens when Roland gets back to the tower with the Horn of Eld? There's that tantalizing piece there that I wouldn't imagine he would ever want to rewrite that story and tell us what happens. That's laid to rest. But I would be interested in finding out more about Roland's Child, or anything he wanted to write about it, I'd be interested in finding out about. But that thing about the siblings, maybe that is specifically what he has in mind for, you know, what he would write if he chooses to write another piece. But in conclusion, you know, the Dark Tower has this kind of central role in the Stephen King multiverse, and underneath that is kind of Castle Rock and Derry, Maine, and Ludlow, Maine, and, you know, the hard case crime novels and a variety of short stories, and everything kind of comes back to this Dark Tower. And for anyone who's watching, if you didn't know this before you watched this video, now you know that everything is just kind of included in this realm, and there's so many different types of crossover, with characters crossing over, and, you know, different landscapes and different themes and ideas. It really is just one marvelous literary landscape. And I know some other authors have done things kind of like this. You know, Brandon Sanderson is an author I'm really getting into with his Stormlight Archive, where he has a trilogy and a main series, which is basically his Dark Tower, is the Stormlight Archive. He has some other books where, like, things influence one another on a kind of relatively minor scale for him, not nearly as influential as Stephen King, but it's the same concept. It's his multiverse. It's the Brandon Sanderson Cosmere is what that one's called. But I don't think any other author has ever taken it to the extent that Stephen King has taken it. Am I wrong about that?
I don't think you're wrong. I mean, I haven't read everything that's ever been published by all authors, so I couldn't say definitively. But the fact that he's taken sort of a core fantasy series and tangled it up with mainstream non-series books to the extent that he has is fairly unique. If you're on Google sometime and you want to really blow your mind, I can't remember the person's name. I think she goes by Tessie Girl. She has made a poster which tries to tie together all of the connections in the Stephen King universe. And it reminds me of that Waterworks games. It's got, you know, or you know, like when you see a crazy person in a movie with their conspiracy wall with all the pins and ropes and things like that. But it's, you know, it's a yeoman's job. It took a lot of time, and she has refined it over the years. It's very interesting to see. But it's it's quite the fact that he has so much of this in his head. And you know, he has to be reminded of it too. That's why Robin wrote the Concordance, because when he was starting to work on the final 3 books, he needed a reference book so he could go back and say, you know, what was this person's name, or where did this happen? And she did that research for him. As a writer myself, I find myself revisiting characters from story to story. I have 3 or 4 series of short stories where I use the same characters, but there's no crossover between those different worlds. Each one, it's sort of like, you know, an Agatha Christie series has Hercule Poirot, or it has Miss Marple, but Marple and Poirot seem to live in different universes. They never meet each other. And I think the majority of writers tend to work that way. Although occasionally, some writers like Michael Connolly, who has 2 or 3 different series characters, Harry Bosch being the original, he's now bringing the characters from some of his different novels together, so that, you know, this guy who was the Lincoln lawyer turns out to be the brother-in-law of Harry Bosch, and they work together. And the woman from the who works the night shift, I can't remember her name right now, but she's now working with Harry Bosch, and so he's sort of tying those worlds together, and they all take place in Los Angeles, and it's sort of all this one universe. And so in the real world, writers do that, but certainly not for as long, or not on such a grand playing field.